James Carter parked his car in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. The clock read 8:42 a.m., and sunlight stretched long shadows across the pavement as James exhaled deeply, frustrated by the late start. As an assistant U.S. attorney, discipline and punctuality were central to his career, but this morning had spiraled unexpectedly. What should have been a routine trip to contest an error in property taxes became anything but. The issues centered on his late grandmother's house, a place brimming with memories of her wisdom and care. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and James had spent weeks compiling evidence to prove the mistake. Wearing a navy suit with a crisp white shirt, he looked composed, even though his morning had been chaotic. An urgent call on a human trafficking case delayed him, leaving James to rush against the clock, balancing duty and personal responsibility. As James Carter stepped into the Raleigh Municipal Courthouse, he couldn't shake the lingering tension from his chaotic morning. The courthouse, with its scuffed wooden benches and beige walls, buzzed with activity. People clutched folders and whispered anxiously, each person consumed by their small but pressing legal matters. James checked his watch, 8:50 a.m. Barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow corridor, the sound of his polished shoes echoing against the tiled floor. Room 204, Judge Samuel Whitaker. James took a moment to adjust his tie and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The courtroom was already filling with people, defendants, attorneys, clerks, all shuffling into their seats. He slid into a spot near the back and opened his folder to review his evidence. A quick glance at the judge's bench revealed Judge Whitaker, a tall, stern man with silver gray hair and a penetrating gaze that scanned the room like a hawk. James had heard of him, a no-nonsense figure with a reputation for being harsh but fair. Or so he thought. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood as Judge Whitaker entered and took his seat. His presence alone silenced the room, his piercing eyes daring anyone to step out of line. James observed closely, noting how the judge handled the first few cases with mechanical efficiency. Fines were issued swiftly, motions dismissed without hesitation. James's legal instincts told him this judge wasn't one for deliberation. He ruled with an iron fist. When James's name was finally called at 9:15 a.m., he made his way to the podium, his calm exterior masking the swirl of thoughts in his head. As he approached, Judge Whitaker's expression darkened. "You're late, Mr. Carter," the judge stated, his voice sharp and cutting through the quiet room. "Do you think this court's time is less valuable than your own?" James raised a hand slightly in acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. You're fined $750 for contempt." The words struck like a gavel hitting wood, reverberating through the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd as James tightened his grip on the podium. He kept his expression neutral, but the sting of the penalty, disproportionate and punitive, was undeniable. Around him, James noted the subtle reactions. A middle-aged man in a suit who had entered late went unnoticed, while a young woman casually scrolling on her phone drew no reprimand. The disparity was glaring. "Your Honor," James began, his tone steady, "may I explain?" "You may not," the judge interrupted, his voice firm. "Consider this a lesson in respecting this court's time." James inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement even as a storm brewed inside him. He returned to his seat, flipping open his folder, but his focus had shifted. His mind raced through the events he had just witnessed. The judge's dismissal of his explanation, the selective enforcement of courtroom rules, and the silence of those around him. It wasn't just about him, it was about something larger, something systemic. As the next case was called, James began taking notes. His pen moved quickly across the page, recording every interaction, every inconsistency, and every unequal treatment he observed. The young woman who had entered late without a word from the judge sat unbothered at the front. Meanwhile, James replayed his own reprimand, the sharp words, the disproportionate fine, and knew it wasn't coincidental. By the time the session ended, James had a clear picture of the courtroom's dynamics. The judge's authority was absolute, but it wasn't wielded equally. The subtle yet unmistakable bias was woven into the very fabric of the proceedings. As James gathered his belongings, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a bad morning. It was an injustice that couldn't be ignored. Walking out of the courtroom, his thoughts solidified into resolve. The $750 fine wasn't the real issue. It was the principle. James had faced bias cloaked in authority before, but this time he wouldn't let it stand unchallenged. The courthouse doors swung open and James stepped into the crisp morning air. He pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed memo to his office, documenting everything. This wasn't just about property taxes anymore. This was about accountability, fairness, and exposing a system that had failed too many for far too long. And James Carter was ready to fight. James Carter stepped into his office at the U.S. Attorney's headquarters in Raleigh with a single focus: to turn his frustration into action. The $750 fine and the blatant inequity in Judge Whitaker's courtroom had ignited something in him, a determination to expose and challenge the systemic bias he had witnessed. As a federal prosecutor, he had spent years combating injustice on a grand scale. But this morning's experience reminded him that even the smallest spaces of power could perpetuate discrimination. James closed the door behind him and set his briefcase on the desk. The fine wasn't about tardiness. It was a symptom of something deeper. The indifference shown to other latecomers, the sharpness of the judge's words directed at him alone, it was unmistakable. He opened his folder, reviewing the notes he'd taken during the court session. Every detail, every interaction, every inconsistency was there. He began typing a memo to his supervisor, laying out the events of the morning in meticulous detail. His tone was professional, but his words carried weight. Halfway through the report, James paused. He couldn't shake the image of the courtroom clerk hesitating as she typed, or the older man in the back row who had offered him a knowing glance. These weren't isolated reactions. They were reflections of a pattern. James decided he needed more than just his perspective. He picked up the phone and called a colleague who had handled municipal cases in Raleigh for years. "Karen," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Have you ever noticed anything off about Judge Whitaker's courtroom?" There was a long pause on the other end before Karen replied, "You're not the first person to ask that. I've heard whispers, fines that don't match the offense, defendants who don't get the same leniency, especially people of color. But no one's ever followed up." That was all James needed to hear. He spent the next several hours making calls to other attorneys, community members, and even a few local journalists he trusted. The responses came in waves, stories of excessive fines, dismissive attitudes, and patterns of inequity that painted a damning picture of Judge Whitaker's courtroom. By the end of the day, James had compiled a thick file of testimonies and public records. A clear pattern was emerging. Defendants of color were fined significantly more than their white counterparts for similar infractions, and their requests for leniency were almost always denied. James's legal instincts told him this wasn't just a bad judge. It was a systemic problem embedded in the municipal court system. The turning point came when a courthouse clerk reached out to him. "I've been keeping a notebook for years," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've written down every time something didn't sit right. I've wanted to speak up, but I was too scared. If you're serious about this, I'll share it." When James met her the next morning, she handed him a small, weathered notebook. Inside were years of observations, dates, names, and specific instances of bias. It was the evidence he needed to take this fight to the next level. As James walked back to his car, clutching the notebook, he felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about challenging a broken system and giving a voice to those who had been silenced. The fight had only just begun, but James Carter was ready. As James Carter sat in his office that evening, the weight of the day's revelations pressed heavily on him. The notebook from the courthouse clerk lay open on his desk, its pages filled with handwritten accounts of blatant disparities. Each entry painted a picture of systemic bias, fines 3 times higher for black defendants, dismissive attitudes toward their explanations, and leniency reserved for others. This wasn't just about Judge Whitaker. It was a microcosm of a larger, broken system. James knew he needed more than anecdotes. His legal training demanded hard evidence, and his role as a federal prosecutor gave him the tools to uncover it. He opened his laptop and began combing through public records. Hours passed as he cross-referenced cases, identifying patterns of disproportionate fines, harsher penalties, and racial disparities. The numbers didn't lie. Judge Whitaker's courtroom had systematically disadvantaged defendants of color for years. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "James," she said, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "I've read your report. This could be much bigger than we thought." "I'm starting to see that," James replied. "The numbers are damning, and the testimonies are even worse. This isn't just negligence. It's deliberate." Julia exhaled sharply. "We need to be careful. If we move forward, this won't just be a local issue. It could draw national attention." "That's exactly why we have to move forward," James said firmly. "This isn't about making headlines. It's about justice," Julia agreed, instructing him to compile everything he had into a formal report for the Judicial Review Commission. Meanwhile, James continued reaching out to the community. Attorneys, former defendants, and even courthouse staff came forward, many of them sharing stories of humiliation and unequal treatment. Each account added to the growing mountain of evidence. By the end of the week, the case had begun to take on a life of its own. A young law student who had witnessed James's exchange with Judge Whitaker wrote a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage and solidarity across the community. Hashtags like #EqualJustice and #Raleigh Court Bias began trending, with people sharing their own experiences of judicial inequity. Local news stations picked up the story, and reporters camped outside the courthouse, demanding answers from Judge Whitaker. The judge, who had long operated with unquestioned authority, now found himself under scrutiny. His initial response was dismissive, claiming his actions were misunderstood and within the bounds of judicial discretion. But the mounting evidence made it impossible to ignore the truth. The Judicial Review Commission announced a formal investigation, sending auditors to comb through years of court records. The courthouse clerk who had given James the notebook became a key witness, her detailed observations corroborating the data. Even the courthouse bailiff, a quiet veteran of 15 years, stepped forward. "I've seen this for too long," the bailiff said during an interview. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I didn't think anyone would listen." As the investigation deepened, James found himself at the center of a growing movement. Community activists organized rallies outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End bias now." National media outlets began covering the story, and James's phone rang nonstop with calls from reporters, colleagues, and supporters. Despite the chaos, James remained focused. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed injustice to thrive. Late one night, as he reviewed his findings, James wrote a single line in his notebook. "This fight isn't just about today, it's about the future." The momentum was unstoppable, and James Carter knew he was ready to see it through. As the Judicial Review Commission's investigation gained traction, the tension in Raleigh intensified. News outlets broadcast updates daily, dissecting the evidence of systemic bias in Judge Whitaker's courtroom. The once quiet courthouse now buzzed with reporters, community activists, and lawyers, all drawn into the unfolding scandal. James Carter, steadfast amidst the chaos, continued piecing together the story of injustice that had taken root in the very institution meant to uphold fairness. The commission's findings were damning. Over the past 5 years, black defendants in Judge Whitaker's courtroom had been fined, on average, 3 times more than their white counterparts for the same offenses. Requests for leniency, like payment plans or reduced penalties, were disproportionately denied to people of color, while white defendants received more favorable treatment. These disparities weren't just statistical. They were personal. Former defendants came forward sharing heartbreaking stories of humiliation and financial hardship. A young single mother described being fined $500 for a zoning dispute despite having clear evidence in her favor. "It wasn't just the fine," she said tearfully during a televised interview. "It was the way he looked at me, like I didn't even matter." Another man recounted how Judge Whitaker dismissed his case with a sharp reprimand, only to treat a white defendant with similar circumstances kindly, just minutes later. James watched these testimonies unfold with a mix of anger and resolve. He recognized that this wasn't about one judge or one courtroom. It was about a system that had allowed such biases to go unchecked for years. The pressure on Judge Whitaker mounted as the commission subpoenaed years of court records and called staff members to testify. The courtroom clerk, whose notebook had been pivotal in exposing the disparities, became a key witness. Her courage inspired others to speak out, including James Wilson, the veteran bailiff. "I've seen this for years," Wilson stated in a public interview. "It's time for it to stop." As the investigation reached its peak, Judge Whitaker held a press conference. His tone was defensive, claiming his decisions were within judicial guidelines. "Any disparities are purely coincidental," he insisted. But the community wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming, and his words did little to quell the growing outrage. Meanwhile, the story had begun to attract national attention. Civil rights groups, legal organizations, and even lawmakers weighed in, calling for reforms in municipal courts across the country. Social media amplified the movement, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #EndCourtBias trending nationwide. James's role in the case turned him into an unexpected public figure. Though he avoided the spotlight, his determination to see the fight through resonated with people across the nation. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission released its preliminary report. It confirmed systemic bias in Judge Whitaker's courtroom and called for sweeping changes, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of case outcomes, and the establishment of oversight committees. Faced with mounting evidence and public pressure, Judge Whitaker announced his resignation in a brief statement, claiming he wanted to preserve the integrity of the court. The announcement sparked mixed reactions. For some, it was an admission of guilt. For others, a necessary step toward healing. But for James, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead, ensuring that the reforms took root and that no other courtroom would repeat the failures of Judge Whitaker's. In the weeks that followed, James turned his attention to broader reforms. He met with state lawmakers, community leaders, and judicial oversight boards to advocate for systemic changes. Meanwhile, the courthouse in Raleigh underwent a transformation. Signs in multiple languages directed visitors to new resources like legal aid and payment plans. A plaque near the entrance read, "Justice is everyone's right." James Carter stood at the heart of it all, knowing the fight for equality in the justice system was far from over. But as he walked past the courthouse one crisp morning, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was possible, and it had already begun. Months after Judge Whitaker's resignation, the Raleigh Municipal Courthouse stood as a symbol of transformation and progress. The beige walls had been repainted in warm, welcoming tones, and new signage in multiple languages greeted visitors, directing them to legal aid, payment plans, and other resources. At the entrance, a plaque now read, "Justice is everyone's right." Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The sense of fear and resignation that once permeated the halls had been replaced with cautious optimism. James Carter walked through those familiar halls, reflecting on how much had changed since the morning that set everything in motion. Judge Whitaker's resignation had marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning. James had worked tirelessly to push for meaningful reforms, knowing that systemic change required more than the removal of one bad actor. The Judicial Review Commission's recommendations had already begun to take effect. Judges, clerks, and court officers were now required to attend mandatory bias training sessions led by legal experts and social scientists. These sessions focused on identifying implicit bias and ensuring equitable treatment for all defendants. Court records were now subject to regular audits to track disparities in sentencing and fines. An independent oversight committee, made up of community leaders, attorneys, and former defendants, was established to monitor courtroom practices. James had become a leading voice for these reforms, speaking at legal conferences, community forums, and law schools. At one event, a young black law student approached him with wide eyes and a notebook full of questions. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Her words stayed with him as he continued his work. The changes in Raleigh were already inspiring other communities to reevaluate their own court systems. Across North Carolina and beyond, judicial boards began conducting their own reviews, uncovering similar patterns of bias and inequity. Activist groups rallied behind the momentum, organizing workshops and public discussions to keep the pressure on. Within the courthouse, familiar faces had taken on new roles. The clerk who had shared her notebook of observations, a pivotal piece of evidence in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had spoken out about the bias he had witnessed, now led training sessions for court officers, emphasizing the importance of fairness and accountability. One afternoon, as James prepared to leave his office, he received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his work and felt compelled to start her own investigation into judicial bias in her city. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place," she wrote. James folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder labeled Impact, alongside similar messages from across the country. For James, the most rewarding moments came from the people whose lives had been directly affected. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that fateful morning stopped him outside the courthouse. "I've been coming here for 40 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said, 'Enough. Thank you for giving us hope.'" The ripple effects of James's stand against bias continued to grow. Statewide, the legal community began embracing a new ethos, one rooted in fairness, transparency, and accountability. James knew the fight wasn't over. Progress was never guaranteed, but for the first time in years, he felt the tide was turning. As he stood outside the courthouse, watching people walk in and out with a renewed sense of trust, James Carter knew the work was worth it. Justice wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a right, one he would continue to fight for. Standing in the back of the newly renovated Raleigh Municipal Courthouse, James Carter watched as community members, attorneys, and judges gathered for the unveiling of the Judicial Ethics Center. Months of hard work had culminated in this moment, but James knew this was only the beginning. As the ceremony began, he reflected on the changes that had taken root: mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and equitable treatment for all defendants. When it was his turn to speak, James approached the podium with a calm yet determined presence. "Justice isn't just about laws," he said, his voice steady. "It's about ensuring every person who steps into our courts is treated with dignity and fairness." The applause that followed was thunderous, but James's focus remained on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, resolve, and the determination to keep pushing for progress. For James, this was a step forward, but the fight for justice was far from over. The story of James Carter in 2025 highlights the enduring importance of accountability, equity, and systemic reform in our institutions. It reminds us that change begins with individuals willing to challenge injustice, even when it's deeply ingrained. Through his courage and perseverance, James turned a moment of personal bias into a nationwide movement for fairness in the judicial system. His journey demonstrates that progress is possible when we combine evidence, advocacy, and community action. In 2025, we are reminded that justice isn't just a principle. It's a practice that requires constant vigilance and a commitment to treating everyone with dignity. James Carter's fight for justice is a reminder that systemic change requires all of us to stand together. To support James and his mission, share this story and spark conversations about fairness in our legal systems. Use your voice on social media or in your community to advocate for judicial accountability and transparency. Let's encourage James to continue his work by pushing for reforms nationwide and mentoring the next generation of changemakers. Together, we can build on his efforts, ensuring every courtroom is a place where justice is blind and equality prevails. Your voice can help drive this movement forward.